Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Krauss. Welcome to yet another session hosted by Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College. This is the second event or discussion that we are hosting on science. I think this is the first year where we have diversified to discussing science and well, because I hold the firm conviction that having a public understanding of science is especially important, given the fact that we almost seem to be living in times where the pendulum has gone to the other extent, in the sense that the denunciation of science comes from quarters where one would not anticipate its denunciation to come. So it's very important to develop a discourse of understanding science. And I'm so grateful that today Professor Lawrence Krauss has agreed to participate in this. I have been following Professor Krauss's content for about a decade by now. Started when I was in middle school and I was really fascinated with science. Initially limited to the let's say the frontiers of science, but gradually also the importance of science at a social level. I'll just, because convention compels me, introduce Professor Lawrence Krauss. Professor Krauss is an internationally known theoretical physicist and a best-selling author. He did his Ph.D. in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1982. And during his career, Professor Krauss has held professorships or distinguished visiting appointments at several institutions of eminence around the world, such as Cambridge, Harvard, CERN, and so forth. In 2008, he was appointed as the foundation professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration and the Physics Department, as well as the inaugural director of the Origins Project at the Arizona State University. Among his numerous important scientific contributions was one in 1995, that most of the energy of the universe resided in empty space. And this is a prediction which was eventually verified in 1999 and also awarded the Nobel Prize in 2011. Um, Two of his books that I found really timely uh, in the recent years was The Physics of Climate Change, which appeared in February 2021, and two of his latest books, The Known Unknowns and The Edge of Knowledge, which really discuss issues such as the God of the Gaps argument, which is often invoked by theists to, let's say, sneak in a God somewhere. So I'm really thankful to Professor Krauss that he agreed to speak to us today. And I'd like to start off with the thing that I mentioned at the very beginning, that the scientific method, at least to me, based on my engagement with your work and that of other scientists in the United States, the scientific method to me seems to be under attack from two distinct sides. On the one side, you have social theorists who, ever since Weber, have linked science to some sort of positivism or some sort of triumphant rise of the Western civilization, colonialism, and every pejorative that you could think of, as a result of which I think in New Zealand there was this attempt to bring down science on par with indigenous knowledge systems, quote unquote. There have been similar attempts in India here as well. And on the other hand, I find that a lot of the books that were published in the 2010s in the United States were sort of taking on religious fundamentalists who argued that scriptural fundamentalism is the key to explaining reality. How do you evaluate this pendular shift? And could you perhaps add a bit of an autobiographical component to this as well?
Well, that's a complex question and it requires a complex answer. There, science has been under attack in a variety of ways from from different sectors. Let me deal with the fundamentalism part first. I think, at least in the United States, about 20 years ago, I think, in my opinion, it reached its peak. The idea that well, the idea that one should Uh, I'll step back. Evolution, ever since Darwin, has created a conflict with religion in some ways, and because it was the first example of the fact that you don't need divine intervention to create human beings, to have the diversity of life on Earth. It's it was a dramatic and probably one of the most important scientific developments in history, and on and off that conflict between science and religion has emerged and then gone into the background. And there was a concerted effort um, to fight the teaching of evolution in schools in the United States starting about 20 years ago. And it was subtle. The idea was that that they would create something that sounded scientific called intelligent design that suggested that things like fundamental cells were simply too complex to have evolved naturally, and that they must have been designed, and that there were features within the cell that suggested evidence of design. That was thoroughly debunked from a scientific perspective, but it gained attention publicly, and there were groups that tried to have intelligent design uh, uh, taught in the schools, and a number of us, including myself, fought that and said that's an attack on science. It's not. You're trying to introduce something that has no scientific basis. I think that largely that particular attack, we largely won that. Um, of course, there'll always be fundamentalists who argue that that independent of what science says, the Earth was created in 7 days or something like that. I don't think one can ever. There are people who, no matter what evidence you give them, they'll never change their minds. But that's one kind of attack. The idea that that there must be beyond something beyond natural processes to make things like life, which seems amazing, or to make the universe, which is one of the reasons I my book, A Universe from Nothing, was written, or at least was important, because the two major questions which sort of suggest a need for divine intervention were, how did life arise, and how did the universe arise? And Darwin kind of addressed the first question, and I tried to address the latter one to show that the remarkable discoveries in the last 50 years have shown that, amazingly, a universe like ours can arise spontaneously from nothing, using extrapolations of the known laws of physics. I couldn't prove it, but I could show it was plausible. And that, I think, was also important. Science can't disprove God, but it can make God irrelevant in some sense, and it largely is, by the way. As I've been a scientist for practicing scientist for 40 years, and at least, and I've never heard in any scientific meeting, not once, the term God come up, because we don't discuss it. We care about how things work. And when you worry about it, there's, physical effects tend to have physical causes, and we've seen no evidence to go beyond that. But at the same time, that's sort of an attack from the religious right, if you wish, on science. But over the last decade or so, there's been an attack from another end, which is, as you pointed out, somewhat from the left. And again, both are well motivated in a sense, but the one from the left was motivated by the idea that we should treat all people equally, which I agree, and we should respect different cultures, which I agree. But it came to an extreme, and the New Zealand example was one example, but the same things happened in the United States. The notion that somehow indigenous people, simply because, by the way, they weren't treated very well, generally their lands eventually were taken over. But it's important to point out that they earlier took over lands from someone else. Everyone is in some sense a settler. But in any case, the idea was that, well, one should respect their ancient wisdom as if it's on par with the evidence of modern science. And in New Zealand and in the United States and elsewhere, it's remarkable how indigenous creationism, indigenous creation myths, which are no different than the Christian creation myths, are somehow recently respected in a way that, say, Christian and Judeo-Christian creation myths aren't. Um, uh, People are hesitant to say, well, these are just myths; they're not true. And in New Zealand and elsewhere, they wanted to treat these creation myths as if they were on par with our evidence from Big Bang cosmology. And of course, it does a disservice to science. I also think it does a disservice to the indigenous people as well. It's fine to respect that cultural background and understand the significance of those cultural beliefs in their own history, and respect that they have had these cultural beliefs and understand them. But when it comes to science, what matters is, does it work or not, and does it make predictions that are correct. And in that sense, we just dispel any notions like creationism, like yesterday's newspaper. We just throw it out because it doesn't work. But we're seeing that attack on the left in terms of respecting indigenous creationism, it's a small part. There are other attacks on the left that somehow suggest that science is systemically racist or sexist. Now, in history, of course, there's been racism and sexism. There's no doubt about that. But the wonderful thing about science is that it proceeds regardless of who's doing it. Scientists themselves may be racist or sexist, but the scientific process is amazing to be able, it's amazingly self-correcting. That if it works, then it proceeds. If it doesn't work, if it doesn't satisfy the test of experiment, it goes out. And if one explanation turns out to be better than another, no matter what segment of the world it comes from and who has presented it, there may be some resistance over time because scientists, as I say, are people. But the scientific process eventually, because of this dialectic, this willingness to attack all ideas and see what works, the best ideas rise to the surface. And at the same time, the last aspect of, I think, the attack on science is some people who feel that an attack on ideas is the same as an attack on them, and that we should be forbidden from attacking ideas because somehow that's an attack on people. And that's a very insidious and unfortunate development recently, especially in the West, that has restricted free speech and open inquiry. And I think we have to fight it dramatically. So those are some of the things I'm concerned about. And I have a new book coming out in July, an anthology that I've written with 39 other scientists and scholars talking about these different attacks on science and how we need to fight them.
So I'll be looking forward to the book and seeing how quickly it will be, say, made available over here in India as well.
Well,
And
I hope it will be. I don't know about its distribution at this point. Right now it's being published in the United States only, United States and Canada, and I'm trying to get it published in England, which would get it to India. So we'll see.
I found a very interesting point when, let's say, you mentioned the ethical component of, let's say, some of the criticisms of science that comes from the left. And I'm reminded of how Stephen Jay Gould, who was also very eminent scientist, and came up with this concept of, say, non-overlapping magisteria. And how do you think that's a coherent way of, let's say, understanding the role of science?
I think it was a cop out, in my opinion. I think it was an effort to try and appease people, but they're not non-overlapping because the fundamental scriptures do make statements about the universe, and they make statements that are wrong, and that the world wasn't created in 7 days, and et cetera, et cetera. And the world didn't stop when someone blew a horn. The Earth didn't stop rotating. The sun didn't stand still in the sky. And so I think it's when it comes to the literal scriptural doctrines of the world's major religions, they all, in one level or another, conflict with our scientific knowledge. So they're not non-overlapping. Now, if one takes a grander view and says, well, these are allegorical studies, and that really one shouldn't take them literally, and in a sense, religion deals with how we should behave, and science deals with how the world works, and therefore they're non-overlapping magisteria. That's a little more acceptable, but it's some but science will always ultimately, I think, infringe on religious claims because ultimately studying human behavior will become, is scientific, and we'll learn more about what drives humans to behave the way they do. And it is true, as David Hume once said, I don't think you can get an ought from an is. You can go along almost all the way. Reason and evidence take you almost all the way. Without knowing what is, you can't get what's ought. So I think religion alone cannot. In fact, this is part of the problem. It's usurped our notions of morality, and religious notions of morality are often, I would say, inappropriate. We have to base our notions of ethics and morality on how the world really works, and it's science that tells us how the world really works. So I think in almost every way that they're not non-overlapping. There are intimate connections, and and for better or worse, I think religious people, if they're honest, have to understand that.
I do agree with that. In fact, another point that just occurred to me is the fact that someone like Descartes could justify animal suffering precisely on on a strand of explanation that's thought that okay, animals don't suffer pain, and that is an is statement. That's not an odd statement. And then he derived all sorts of dubious moral positions from it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a perfect example of a claim that leads to a moral or ethical argument, but the claim is wrong. And that's great thing about science. The really great thing about science is we change our minds. That's the fundamental difference in my mind between science and religion. Science corrects itself and changes. We change our minds. It's the beauty of science. And and so when we change our minds, we have to change. Uh, when we change our understanding of the world, we therefore are driven to change our views about how things work and how we should behave. And I think we see that Steven Pinker's book on more or less on how the Enlightenment has made the world a better place, how reason has made the world a better place. I think is perfectly accurate. We don't do things now that we did 100 years ago that we now understand are unethical because 100 years ago people didn't understand things. Animal suffering, the fact that animals do suffer. I happen to be a vegetarian, in part because of that. We Slavery was often justified because of misrepresented notions about different races, which we now understand from a scientific perspective is nonsense. So I think science leads us, I think, leads us to, in principle, create a better world. Of course, science is science, and how we use it depends upon us, and how we turn science into public policy is beyond the domain of science itself. And so science can be used for many things, good and bad. We can create new power sources like nuclear reactors, or we can create nuclear weapons. It's up to us.
But at the same time, it almost seems as if, despite the rationality or the force of this argument, the emotive appeal is still strong enough to lure people. Like, for instance, I came across the fact that I think Ayan Hirsi Ali accepted Christianity, and then she had a discussion with Richard Dawkins. How do you, for instance, how do you view her justification? What's your
No,
take on it?
Anne is a friend, and I wrote to her privately, not publicly, after she announced her conversion. I think I understand it in a variety of ways. Partly, her conversion is utilitarian in the sense that she views Islam as a major threat, for obvious reasons in her own personal life, among other things. And I think she views Christianity as a wedge against that threat. So one needs to have some religious system that counters Islam, is her view. Not mine, but hers. The other thing is, I think you have to understand she grew up in a very religious household. And when you grow up in a very religious household, it's really hard. It's very difficult when you imbue kids before they can think with this notion of religion. It doesn't come here, it comes here. And it's very difficult to get rid of it. And I think she really felt a spiritual gap in her life that slowly arose because of her atheism. And I don't think it has anything to do with atheism. I think it has to do with the fact that she was, indoctrinated with religion when she was young. So, from a personal perspective, having some belief like that makes her feel better. It's the same reason a lot of people are religious. So, I think from a personal perspective, I think I understand why it makes her feel better. But I also understand from a political perspective why she feels that Christianity is a necessary wedge against what she views as a great global threat, which is Islam. That's my opinion. And I told her that in a letter, and we didn't have a public dialogue about it because I didn't think it was necessary to have a public dialogue.
To the point about how atheism often leaves a void in the hearts of people who have been indoctrinated into religion, leads me to think about whether new atheism, and I did pretty much grow up watching a lot of content and reading some of the books which I could have understood at that age, others that I could not have understood at that age. How do you think that new AC? How do you evaluate the new atheism movement in retrospect? Do you think it was a bit insensitive to the social
Well,
necessity of religion?
I never understand the term new atheism. I mean, atheism is not is simply not willing to believe things that don't have no evidence. So I don't understand what's new about it. So when people talk about new atheism, I think they just talk about some people that are more vocal, like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and to sometimes me. Um, uh, but it's not new. It's been around as long as people have doubted these stories. I think I understand people's reaction to the vocal nature, but at the same time, I think it's really important because for a long time people were afraid to speak out because religion had a monopoly on morality. If you said you weren't religious, you were viewed as a bad person. In fact, the Richard Dawkins Foundation in England about a decade ago, um, did a survey of people who had claimed they were Christian. In the national surveys, people have to put their religion, and so the Church of England was listed, and they talked to people who put that they were part of the Church of England, and they asked them, "Do you believe in virgin birth? Do you believe in transubstantiation?" And they said, "No, no, 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 no," because they didn't. And then the question was, "Why did you say you're Christian?" And the answer was, "I like to think I'm a good person." And I think that's the point that it's important for people to be speak up so that people can see that you can be a good person even if you doubt the existence of God. And I will tell you, I've had that personal experience more when you may have seen the movie about me and Richard Dawkins called The Unbelievers. I'm not sure if you ever saw it. Um, that movie reached a lot of people, and I got a lot of letters from people who weren't, fundamentalists, but they were in small towns in the United States, and they said, I was so amazed to see all these people at the Reason rally, for example, because I'm in this small town and I kind of doubt whether I have questions about God, but I'm afraid to talk to anyone about it. There's no one to talk to, and if I did, my neighbors would shun me. And so I think it's really important for people to realize that many people speak out and feel free to speak out and feel free to question, and questioning doesn't make you a bad person. And in that sense, I think that what you would call new atheism is a good thing.
Mm. So, if I were to sum it up, I think the whole crux of the movement was to delink atheism from, let's say, any necessary or concomitant ethical position to encourage the spirit of reason and inquiry.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, it's interesting, sociologically how this arose. I think it was clearly bubbling for a long time. The fact that I remember when Richard wrote his book, The God Delusion, I reviewed it, and I just didn't think it would be very successful because I didn't know who he was speaking to because the atheists wouldn't buy it because they bought it or yeah, already accepted it, and religious people wouldn't be interested. But I was shocked at how popular it became. Clearly, there was a need. A lot of people felt that, and same with my late friend Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, which I think is one of the best books on the subject. Um, Clearly, these became huge bestsellers, uh, and that clearly addressed a need. And that I'm happy they were produced because a lot of people clearly had been thinking this or wanting this, but not brave enough or whatever to vocally say this. And so the fact that Richard and Christopher Hitchens were able to write about this, I think freed up a lot of people. And I know a lot of people have written me since then, about how their lives have been freed up because of that.
I noticed that you attended a recent discussion to commemorate the life of Christopher Hitchens. Could you, for the sake of, let's say, an audience in India, for instance, um, which will only have engaged, out of which only a very small niche would have engaged with his works, what sort
Yeah.
of, let's say, lesson or major points would you, let's say, think are valuable for us?
Um, well, I think the key thing about Christopher was that he didn't suffer fools gladly. Uh, um, and he said he was willing to speak out even when his views were unpopular. He was also a brilliant debater and writer. It was eloquent and humorous, and therefore his writing and his debates are beautiful to watch. And he did debate religion in a wonderful way, and in an eloquent way, because he was well read, one of the most well read people I've ever known. But it was also his wit and his literary knowledge that added to this. But he couldn't be pigeonholed necessarily, because he defended some things that people on the left disagree with. He was an advocate for the invasion of Iraq, something I disagreed with him about. But as he said, I don't care. I have the right to speak my opinion, and even if the whole world disagrees with me. And then he said something a little more vulgar, which you can hear in the if you watch the video of that event, the Hitchmas event in December in England. And so I think that the lesson that Christopher gave us is to feel free to speak your mind. And on the other hand, you should also be prepared to defend your beliefs. But as he said, claims that are presented without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
Mm. The Hitchens
That's a
razor.
very important. That's a very important statement.
Yeah. And his, if I remember the name correctly, Letters to a Young Contrarian was also a fantastic book that I read when I was rather young. I would recommend
Yeah,
to everyone else
yeah.
also
So,
to read.
so he was a contrarian, and he told people how to be a contrarian. He 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 for a while he had a position which I think many of us would like to have. Many of us are called devil's advocates, but he was literally a devil's advocate, because the Catholic Church asked him to. It's a position that the Catholic Church creates when they're sanctifying someone and making them a saint. And when Mother Teresa was being considered for sainthood, he was asked to be the devil's advocate, and he argued strongly why she shouldn't be a saint. Boy, that's a position that many of us would like to have.
Mm. And I think you mentioned that you did it pro bono.
Yeah, I don't know if he did it pro bono. Did he do it pro bono? Anyway, it's the Catholic, yeah, Catholic. Yeah, anyway, yeah, that would be interesting.
Mhm. Uh, there is another of the four horsemen, as they were often called,
Hmm.
Professor Dennett, who recently passed away as well.
Yes.
And could you share a bit of, say, of your, let's say, experiences with him? He seemed to be a very mild-mannered, uh,
No, Dan
almost
Dennett wasn't
sagely
very
person.
mild-mannered, jovial. He sort of looked like Santa Claus, and acted like Santa Claus. He The thing about Dan that I particularly appreciated, because some people think I don't like philosophy. It's not true. But he was a philosopher. And what I've argued is that philosophy is useful in when it comes to science, in those areas of science where the questions aren't well defined. It's not useful in physics, because in physics we've moved way beyond natural philosophy. The important questions are defined by scientists, because there's so much intellectual baggage that needs to be developed. But there are areas where where our knowledge is less strong, and one of the areas is consciousness. And there philosophy can be useful, because it can define the questions. And what I liked about Dan was that he tied his philosophy to experiment. He tied the philosophical questions he asked to developments in neuroscience, and that's the kind of philosophy that's very, very useful. But he was mild mannered, and therefore his arguments about religion were could had an additional effect, because some people say that we're strident, which amazes me, because we're very rarely say, often we say things quite humbly, but then we're called strident. Um, but Dan Dennett was so mild mannered that it was hard to call him strident, and that was useful too.
At the same time, I think there have been a couple of heterodox attempts to explain consciousness, not just from, let's say, a philosophical perspective, which elucidates some of or problematizes some of the ambiguities. There have been a couple of heterodox attempts, such as those by Professor Penrose, that I found rather interesting, partly because perhaps I'm not competent enough to evaluate the scientific merits of the argument. How do you take Professor Penrose's view of consciousness and the phenomenon that underlie it?
Well, look, I'm not an expert in it. I do know that I look. He wrote a book early on. I think it was called Shadows of the Mind. I forget the name. Um, Penrose is a brilliant mathematician, and he's had a strong impacts on mathematics and physics. So he obviously won the Nobel Prize for work he did on singularities and black holes. Um, I've never found his arguments regarding consciousness particularly compelling in any way. Ultimately, it seems to me he's arguing that quantum gravity somehow is an essential part of the way the brain works, and it doesn't make any physical sense to me. Or even that quantum mechanics in any central way plays a central role in consciousness. The brain is a complex system of interacting neurons. It's messy. It's not a pure quantum mechanical state. And there can be quantum effects, of course, which are relevant in biology, and some of them are being understood. But I've never actually found any of his arguments about consciousness particularly compelling. On the basis of everything I know about physics, I dispel I don't take them seriously. Now I'm happy to be wrong if later on some evidence is provided, but I don't know of any.
Do you think that such attempts to, let's say, mm, bring uh, concepts in physics which one would ideally associate only at the extremities of physics, for instance, from as far as I understand, quantum effects only work at the extremely micro level, or on the other hand, other effects in science that are associated with the extreme macro level. Do you think it's a bit of a cop out to suggest that all right, consciousness is rather complicated and therefore we need these complicated theories to explain it?
I don't know whether it's a cop out, but look, the last chapter of my new book is about consciousness, and it's by far the most complicated thing. We don't understand it at all. Literally, I became convinced. I thought that beforehand, and the more research I did, the more I was convinced that even the people who study consciousness can't even define it. And so, I think it's anything we can't understand, people try and throw everything at. And so it's natural that they try and throw the fact that at the limits of physics, there are things we don't understand. And maybe the reason we don't understand consciousness is we don't understand the limits of physics. Maybe it happens, and it's I guess a natural tendency. But I think it's inappropriate. I should correct you that generally quantum mechanics only applies to the very small, but of course there are areas in the world where quantum mechanics applies in macroscopic situations like superconductivity, and we're working on developing materials and things like quantum computers where quantum effects are macroscopically important. But you have to very, very carefully design these systems and engineer them in order for that to be the case. So generally, it's true that quantum mechanics applies to very small, and general relativity, for example, applies to very big.
Mm. Right. I only took the macro level to illustrate the other end of extremities or the frontiers of physics. Yes, quantum physics does operate only at the extremely micro level.
Yeah, and the
Yes.
reason, by the way, the reason this is interesting, and the reason I, as a particle physicist, got interested in cosmology, is this connection between the very small and the very large. Because the universe is expanding, once it was very small, and therefore physical processes at the smallest scales ultimately impact on what we see on the largest scales today, which is kind of remarkable.
One of the models that, since I asked a question about Professor Penrose, another
Mhm.
issue which comes up at this moment to my mind is strings theory, and I came across mm, Dr. Lee Smolin, who sort of wrote an entire book to argue that all right, string theory isn't real science because of the fact that it doesn't make any testable predictions, and because you can just go on increasing the number of dimensions among the different variants of string theory. Do you agree with these charges by Dr. Smolin?
No. I have been called a critic of string theory myself. I'm a critic of the hype that was associated with string theory in the 80s and 90s. But I think look, string theory is, you're right, it hasn't yet it hasn't addressed the questions, it hasn't given answers to the questions it was designed to answer, which is why are the four forces of nature the way they are, and why do we have the particles we have, and all the rest. But it was well motivated. I wrote a book basically about the motivation behind string theory called Hiding in the Mirror. I think string theory has been a vast failure in terms of trying to do what it was originally intended to do. However, the mathematics of string theory has been applied in other areas of physics very usefully. Moreover, the fact that it hasn't yet had any successes doesn't mean it's wrong, or doesn't mean it's even ill-motivated. It just means we shouldn't proclaim it as the theory of everything when we have no evidence that it is. But it's just a really, since it's primarily a theory of quantum gravity, quantum gravitational effects only are relevant at 2 points as far as we know in the universe. One at the very beginning of the universe, and two in the center of black holes. And it's hard to imagine how you can test either. So it's very, very difficult to imagine tests of string theory. Now, had string theory predicted, for example, that there'd be an energy of empty space like we measure now, it would have been a great success. Instead, it predicted exactly the opposite, and one of its big failures. So it hasn't been successful, but that doesn't mean it's wrong, and that doesn't mean it's ill-motivated. It does mean, however, that we shouldn't. That I was concerned when, and I think Lee was. I knew him. He was a colleague of mine for a while. There was a time when basically the entire particle physics young people were going into string theory, and all of the research support was going into string theory, and that seemed inappropriate given. I mean, mathematically it was very exciting, but given what it had done, it was or what it showed great promise, but that promise wasn't fulfilled. And now I think the equilibrium is there. There are people who are still working on it, very intelligent people, very dedicated people, and I think it's worthwhile them spending time on it. But lots of the particle physics community has returned to the world of four dimensions that we know and love.
This question is partly related to the issue that we started off our conversation with, the scientific method. And in, let's say, the traditional renditions of the scientific method as we are acquainted with, as in students of, let's say, the social sciences or the philosophy are acquainted with, Popper's notion of falsifiability or the importance of falsifiability comes in. Now, you mentioned that theories of quantum gravity only really come in very extreme conditions, like the Big Bang or black holes. Do you think falsifiability is a valid measure of such theories at this stage?
I think falsifiability is important, and and so ultimately, what string theorists are looking for is a prediction that can be falsified. Okay, and you can imagine such predictions. You can imagine that string theory predicted something about, say, gravitational waves generated in the early universe that we could then test with future gravitational wave detectors that could be shown to be wrong. So right now, the problem with string theory is that it isn't falsifiable in the sense that it doesn't make any hardcore predictions that can be tested at present. But that's just at present. You don't know what the future will bring. So the fact that something isn't falsifiable now uh, doesn't make it not science, as long as it has the potential to be falsified. A very good example is general relativity. It did make predictions which agreed with observation, but those were post hoc predictions, if you wish. I mean, I don't know what you call the post hoc predictions, but they were postdictions, like the perihelion of Mercury. But ultimately, actually, Einstein could have, had he had the courage of his convictions, predicted that the universe must be expanding, because general relativity doesn't account for a static universe. Instead, he had to be dragged there kicking and screaming, but that would have been a prediction, for example. But anyway, the point is that we are now able to test general relativity with exquisite accuracy. We couldn't when he developed it, but that didn't make it uninteresting, obviously. So things are temporal. The fact one can't falsify something now doesn't mean we'll never be able to falsify it. Except that, but to come back to our discussion at the beginning, the notion of God is completely unfalsifiable because whatever I say, you can say, well, God, this, you can always come up with some reason that God is works in mysterious ways, and so that's one of the reasons science and religion are different.
I think that's partly why God can fill in any gap because
Well,
of
God can, except some gats do. Yeah, I'm not so sure because sometimes religious proponents make claims for God that later on those gaps disappear. And a good example was they made claim that God created all life at the same time and humans at the same time well, they didn't know about amoebas. But that gap got quickly filled, and so religious people have to be very careful about what they claim for God because then those gaps go away. But when the gaps go away, you can always say, "Oh God, well, that was a misinterpretation of God. He really didn't do that." And so God is a very slippery concept because no one can even define the concept of God because that's what makes God so powerful. The concept of God so powerful is it's not definable, so it can be whatever you want it to be.
yeah. There was another bit in mm, what you had to say about string theory that also caught my attention. The mathematical aspect of string theory. And there's this, there's a German scientist, Sabine Hossenfelder, and
Yeah.
I came across her book, Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray. Do you think her charges in the book are fair against this obsession
Well, I
with
don't agree with all of them.
elegance?
I think if you look at the back of the book, you'll find a blurb for me. I think I've quoted. Um, I like the fact that she's contrarian. I don't agree. I don't go as far as she does. I don't decry. Look, elegance and beauty are one way that some theorists try and understand things. They don't mean anything. The fact that a theory may be elegant does not mean it's true. And I really object to the notion that something must be true because it's elegant. That's nonsense. And I accept the fact that a lot of effort and credence is sometimes given to things that don't have empirical underpinnings. So I agree with her about those things. But I'm less willing to dismiss the efforts because I've seen in my life, and I'm a little older than Sabina, and as I say, I've interacted with her a lot. We'll do another podcast again, as a matter of fact. But I've seen how things that look like they have nothing to do with reality can eventually come around and be important.
Do
I
you
think
think
I like to think about let a thousand flowers bloom. You never know which one is gonna lead to to enlightenment.
do you think part of her, let's say, dismissal of the scientific enterprise? I know I'm perhaps putting this in too strident a way. Do you think part of it comes from the way academia is structured for scientists, in the sense that you have to come up with the sort of pressures that scientists have to face to fulfill publication criterias, or let's say present their concepts in a certain manner? Do you think those are significant constraints that scientists have had to face?
Well, look, there's a lot of problems with academia and pressures to publish and other things, and one could, I guess, it's kind of like democracy, as maybe Winston Churchill said. I'm not sure. It may be the worst way to govern people, except for all the others. Um, and so, look, the system that exists has problems, and it produces problems. But ultimately, the scientific method overcomes those in the long run. Ultimately, good ideas survive and bad ideas don't because of this dialectic of the fact that science is a social activity and ideas are attacked and experiments can disprove things. But it's nice to explore and see how things can change. Peer-reviewed research still seems to be the best way to. well, it seems to be the best way to promulgate information. Maybe I've argued, and some other people have, maybe we shouldn't, maybe all research should be peer reviewed, but the articles should be published alongside the peer reviews so that you can judge them. And there's some discussion of that. So, maybe things can be improved here or there, but um, it's a tough it's a tough business, but it should be a tough business because it's a real privilege to be able to be paid to spend your time asking these kind of questions. And therefore it shouldn't be too easy and to be employed to do that, because it um, there's a lot. It's not necessarily productive. It's a privilege, and so it's okay if the system is hard at some level. And there's always abuses, and there's always people who worthy people who are hard done by and inappropriately. It's just I don't think there's any way to protect against that universally ever.
But at least one respect in which, let's say, peer review seems to exacerbate um, at least some subsets of the scientific enterprise is in the sense that there's a great degree of polarization even across or even in certain fields. So, for instance, let's say if you were to publish a paper in biology today, which would argue that, let's say, gender is determined, let's say, on a chromosomal basis, I think that would receive a lot of pushback even in peer review. And
Oh,
that is something that,
there's pushback, and that's inappropriate, and we need to fight that. We need to fight it, but I think it's temporary, and eventually it'll be self-correcting. But you're right, there are groups that basically, because of fears of somehow offending people, don't let the right science be stated, and it's awful. And that's one of the things we talk about in our book. Um, Sex has a meaning in biology, and gender is much more ephemeral, but sex has a meaning in biology, and there are two sexes in humans, and whether you like it or not, and there it has to do with the size of gametes, and see that some people don't want to say that for fear of offending people who are transgender people. But again, it's important to remember that gender and sex are different. So yeah, there are constraints, there are censorship. Nature by the magazine Nature Behavior, for example, argued that its editors should not publish articles that basically offend people. Just an awful thing, and I think we need to fight that. But that's what I'm saying. The sociology of science is different than science, because scientists and publishers of science are people, and they can be wrong. And so we fight it, and eventually, hopefully, we win.
just a brief follow-up related to that, and I think I'll leave the last couple of minutes for questions from the audience if they happen to have any questions. Um,
Sure. No, yeah, that's great. I've really enjoyed your questions, by the way. I've enjoyed our discussion. It's been great.
Thank you so much, sir.
I'm happy to answer some more from the audience if there are any.
Just a final question from my side. I came across a couple of years ago a book by Robert Sapolsky called Behave, and a
Yeah.
bit of his online content. And I think he really attempted to deal with the issue of, let's say, the basis, let's say, of gender identity or gender perception and the sexes. And he seemed to take a stance much more favorable to a certain degree of fluidity in those respects. So, how do you evaluate, let's say, Professor Sapolsky's works in those regards, if you have engaged with his works, that is?
Well, I know Robert Spolsky well, and we've interacted for a long
Mhm,
time, and we just did a recent podcast on his more recent book,
mhm.
Determined, about free will. I have great respect for him, great respect for him as a scientist and intellect. Um, I think his efforts to understand the neuroscientific basis of behavior, and to recognize that, I mean, even in that book, I think he initially does, and then in his next book, he's more clear about it, that that we're not that we can want to change behavior, but punishing people is a different thing, because um, people are often behave well. Our behavior is determined. It's determined by a huge number of things, including biological factors of gender or sex, but also our history, the history of our parents and their parents, and and um, and therefore, bad behavior has at its root many, many, many causes. And what we should be trying to do is to try and remove those causes or constrain the behavior. But punishing people is a different thing. And I think he goes to the extreme saying that basically, while if someone commits, a murder, they should be put in jail, but not as punishment, but to be kept, to protect others and eventually to be rehabilitated if it's possible, to change their behavior and then let out. And I think it's a very sensible way of thinking. So I think his books are wonderful and they're pleasant and he's a very interesting person to listen to. And he has such a broad range of understanding of neuroscience and biology and other things that he's wonderful. He was going to be going on a trip my foundation's organizing to Bhutan, but unfortunately he's had to cancel for health reasons. But I really would have loved to have him along.
Just one final comment before, yeah, we can take up
See
the
one
question by
question in the
Soumya.
chat window, by the way, so that's good to know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think in one of Professor Sapolsky's articles that I came across, he effectively made a very similar point that gender is fluid, but the fact that people are so constrained by our history to view it as a dichotomy means that a coercive attempt to, let's say, impose the acceptance of its fluidity is likely to be counterproductive. And I think that really gels in with his other works about that you just mentioned in his latest book, Determined.
yeah, I think it's a great point. It's a great point. Um, and he, as much as anyone else, realizes the vicissitudes of human behavior, and as I say, gender is a psychological concept as much, or at least one's identification of gender, one's self-identifying gender is psychologically based among many other things, and that's his area of expertise. And once again, I think and that's part of the problem in the United States now. Sure, there's a reaction, the Trump administration, to some of the ridiculous claims about there being more than two sexes, but at the same time, they're trying to punish transgender people for things over which they have no control in some cases. Now, I do agree, looking at schools, that many things become faddish, and I think there's no doubt that being trans or non-binary was kind of chic and attractive to young people for a long time, and suddenly in the last few years, and you see a lot more cases of people, at least temporarily, claiming they're non-binary or they're trans and then changing their mind. But because it was very au courant, it was very, so I think there's some of that in there, and one has to, especially when it comes to minors, I agree completely that one should not be doing surgery on minors because people's, notions of gender evolve, and minors are not capable of not only making those kind of decisions, but they're hormonally, they'll change as they get into adolescence and beyond. So I agree that one has to be very careful when it comes to to treatment of minors. On the other hand, when it comes to adults, I'm a I'm a I'm a strong believer in freedom of speech, but also freedom of choice in many ways. And I think as long as you're not hurting others, I tend to be kind of um, um, gracious if I can. I see two questions. Should I answer these in the chat room? They're very
Yes, so
different questions.
there's only one question. I think he
I
sent
see.
it
Oh,
accidentally.
okay. Um, oh, I say no. I see two. I see one about climate change. Well, it's one person. He's elaborated. Um, Yeah, okay. Well, actually, they're both about climate change, and they're very good questions, which is really the physics of climate change. And the physics of climate change is basically very simple, and it's alluded to there in the question. In a physical system, if you have more energy coming in than going out, it heats up. If you have more energy going out than coming in, it cools down. And if the amount of energy going out is equal to the energy coming in, it remains in equilibrium. It remains at a constant temperature, generally. And that's what it is in the Earth. And so one can actually not just calculate how much energy is coming into the Earth from the sun. It's easy to do. We know how much energy the sun's producing. And we can see how much energy is going out from the Earth. And we can actually not just, and we can theoretically say that carbon dioxide absorbs energy in certain bands of the infrared spectrum, and therefore it restricts the energy outflow from the Earth, and it causes in general less energy to go out into space than would otherwise be the case. And that, at least temporarily, will cause the Earth to heat up until we reach a new equilibrium. But then we can also measure it. We can actually measure this thing called radiative forcing. We can measure the wattage of energy coming in versus the wattage of energy going out. We find there's about between 1 and 3 watts per square meter more energy coming in than going out. And that just tells us that that's the basis of climate change. So it's very simple physics, high school level physics, as I tried to show at a fundamental level. Now, at the level of trying to understand details of climate and ocean currents and how rainfall will be affected and the effects of clouds, those are much more complicated. But the basic effect is simple, straightforward, and well tested. And moreover, the evidence agrees with the predictions. We know how much carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere in the last 80 years, and we can measure that the atmospheric abundance has increased by amount that's roughly exactly the amount we put in, and therefore strongly suggestive that we are affecting the carbon dioxide abundance globally. But we can also say, given that, what would we expect to be the change in the global temperature of the Earth? And it'd be about a degree or 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that's exactly what's happened. So if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Okay, now I see another one. Um, uh, okay, well, this is a question about mathematics and general relativity. This person is intimidated by the mathematical background needed. When it comes to math, it is intimidating. I often tell my students that the first time they see some complex argument, mathematical argument in physics, they find it difficult to understand. And the second time they say, "Oh, I've seen that before." Namely, it's a matter of becoming familiar. Mathematics is like playing the piano in a way. I mean, you have to keep practicing, and eventually you become comfortable with it. Um, Whether you lose the sense of beauty and elegance, look, you have to step back. The details are always complex and messy. In a mathematical calculation, the details are often messy, and only after the fact can you step back and see the beauty. It's just the way it is. But just keep working. Don't be intimidated. Uh, there are well-defined mathematical techniques and in differential geometry that require some understanding and plugging through, and it becomes messy, and there's lots of indices sometimes, and often you lose the forest for the trees. But at the end, you have a result, and then you can bask in the beauty of the result. Okay, maybe that's a good way to end, I think, actually, probably. It's a good bit of advice for students in physics in general. And you don't have to be the best mathematician in the world to be a good physicist. Don't be intimidated if there are others who are better mathematically than you. I know many colleagues, and I mean many colleagues of mine who've won the Nobel Prize in physics, who are not the best in their class mathematically, and sometimes even in physics class. So just keep plugging away, and remember why it is you enjoy it, and step back and remember why it fascinates you, and then don't let the bastards get you down. That's my last bit of advice, and I think it's a good way to end, if you don't mind.